The antique brass doorknob felt cold against my palm as I stood outside the mahogany-paneled conference room of Morrison, Bradley and Associates. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of my family members seated around what I knew was an imposing oak table that had witnessed decades of estate planning and family disputes. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I wasn't supposed to be here. The funeral was 3 days ago. 3 days since we'd buried my grandfather, Thomas Wellington Hartwell, patriarch of the Hartwell manufacturing dynasty and the man who'd built our family's fortune from a single textile mill in North Carolina into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise spanning half the continent. 3 days since my siblings had made it abundantly clear that my presence at today's reading would be unnecessary, unwelcome, and frankly, inappropriate. "There's really no point in you coming, Jessica," my older brother Marcus had said with that particular blend of condescension and false sympathy he'd perfected over our 32 years of sibling rivalry. Grandfather's wishes were quite specific about the family business staying within certain limits, parameters. My sister Victoria had been more direct, as always. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Jess. You made your choices 15 years ago when you walked away from everything grandfather built. Some decisions have consequences." But here I stood anyway, my hand trembling slightly as I gripped the door handle. Not because I expected anything from the will reading. I'd accepted long ago that my grandfather's disappointment in my life choices had effectively written me out of the family legacy. I was here because something felt wrong, something my grandfather had whispered to me during our last conversation in his hospital room, words that had haunted me through 3 sleepless nights. "The truth always finds a way, little sparrow," he'd said, using the pet name he'd called me since childhood. "Sometimes it just takes a little longer than we'd like." I pushed open the door. The conversation stopped mid-sentence as 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me. The conference room was exactly as imposing as I'd remembered from the few times I'd been allowed inside as a child. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with leather-bound legal volumes, Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's, cars and oil paintings of stern-faced men in suits who looked remarkably like my grandfather. At the head of the table sat Harold Morrison himself, the family's longtime attorney and grandfather's closest friend. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite being 83 years old, and his 3-piece suit looked like it had been tailored yesterday. To his right sat a woman I didn't recognize, younger, maybe 45, with sharp eyes and an equally sharp black suit. Around the rest of the table, the Hartwell family had assembled in all their uncomfortable glory. Marcus sat to Morrison's left, his wife Stephanie beside him, both wearing expressions of barely concealed irritation at my arrival. Victoria occupied the chair across from them, flanked by her husband Charles and their twin 18-year-old sons, Brandon and Blake, who had clearly been brought along to witness their inheritance into the family dynasty. My Uncle Robert, grandfather's younger son, sat with his second wife Patricia, wife number 3 if you count the brief Vegas marriage he'd had annulled. Their daughter Madison, my 25-year-old cousin who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow held a vice president title at Hartwell Industries, was scrolling through her phone with the bored expression of someone who assumed this was all a formality. At the far end of the table, my grandmother's sister Eleanor perched like a hawk, her disapproving gaze fixed on me from the moment I'd entered. Beside her, my great-uncle William wheezed slightly as he breathed, his 90-year-old frame draped in a suit that had probably been expensive when Carter was president. The only person who looked genuinely pleased to see me was my youngest cousin, Timothy, Robert's son from his first marriage. At 28, Tim had always been the black sheep of his generation, an artist who'd refused to join the family business and had consequently been relegated to the margins of family gatherings. He gave me a small, encouraging nod from his position at the table's corner. "Jessica," Harold Morrison said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to managing difficult family dynamics. "I wasn't expecting you today." Neither. Was anyone else, apparently, I replied, letting my gaze sweep across the assembled faces. But I decided to come anyway. Marcus cleared his throat. Jessica, we discussed this. There's really no need for you to… Actually, the sharp-eyed woman beside Morrison interrupted, there is. She opened a leather portfolio and extracted a document. I'm Sarah Chen, Mr. Morrison's associate. We were just about to begin, and according to Mr. Hartwell's instructions, all potential beneficiaries should be present. Victoria's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together. Potential beneficiaries? Harold, we understood that the will was quite straightforward. The business assets transfer to Marcus as the eldest son, with trust provisions for the rest of the family. Jessica hasn't been involved in family affairs for over a decade. 15 years, Eleanor corrected sharply. 15 years since she turned her back on everything Thomas built, everything this family represents, running off to California to pursue her little artistic dreams instead of honoring her obligations. The familiar sting of that old wound hit exactly as Eleanor had intended. 15 years since I'd graduated from Columbia with my MFA and announced that I wanted to write novels instead of joining Hartwell Industries' marketing department as planned. 15 years since the explosive argument with my grandfather that had ended with him telling me that if I wanted to waste my education and my opportunities, I could do it without the family name supporting me. Mother, Robert said mildly, though I wasn't sure if he was addressing Eleanor or defending me. With Robert, it was always difficult to tell which way his loyalties would fall on any given day. Perhaps we should proceed with the reading, Morrison suggested diplomatically. As Sarah indicated, Thomas left very specific instructions about how this should be conducted. He opened a thick manila folder and withdrew what appeared to be a substantial document. The will itself was bound in dark blue covers with brass corners, the kind of formal presentation that suggested this wasn't some simple 2-page document, but a comprehensive estate plan that had taken considerable time and legal expertise to construct. The last will and testament of Thomas Wellington Hartwell, executed on March 15th of this year, Morrison began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings. March 15th. That was less than 6 months ago, well after my grandfather's 80th birthday celebration that I hadn't been invited to, and just 2 months before his unexpected heart attack. For a man who'd had his estate plan in place for decades, it seemed odd that he'd made revisions so recently. I, Thomas Wellington Hartwell, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament. The opening formalities continued for several minutes. The standard legal language about revoking previous wills, appointing executors, and providing for debts and expenses. I found myself studying the faces around the table, noting the barely contained anticipation in Marcus's expression, the satisfied smugness Victoria wore like expensive perfume, and the calculating attention Eleanor paid to every word. To my beloved grandson Timothy Robert Hartwell, Morrison continued, who has chosen to pursue his artistic passions despite family pressure to conform, I leave the sum of $5 million to be held in trust until his 30th birthday, along with the art collection housed at the Hartwell estate, recognizing his appreciation for creative expression. Timothy's eyes widened in surprise. $5 million was generous, but not overwhelming in the context of my grandfather's wealth. The art collection, however, was worth considerably more. Grandfather had been an astute collector of American painters, and his pieces included several museum-quality works. To my great-nephew Brandon and Blake Harrison, Morrison read, referring to Victoria's sons, I leave educational trusts of $2 million each, to be used for their continued education and establishment in their chosen professions. Victoria looked pleased but not surprised. $4 million for her sons was exactly the kind of provision she would have expected and likely negotiated with grandfather during one of their regular Sunday dinners. To my daughter-in-law Patricia Hartwell, I leave the sum of $1 million in recognition of her care for my son Robert during his recent health challenges. Patricia's face flushed with surprise and gratitude. She'd been Robert's wife for only 5 years, and the family had never quite accepted her. $1 million bequest suggested grandfather had appreciated her devotion more than anyone had realized. To my great-niece Madison Hartwell, I leave the sum of $3 million, along with the vacation property in Martha's Vineyard in hopes that she will use both the financial resources and the peaceful setting to discover her own path in life. Madison looked up from her phone for the first time since the reading had begun, her expression shifting from boredom to genuine interest. $3 million plus the Martha's Vineyard house, which was worth at least another $2 million, represented a substantial inheritance for someone who'd been coasting through life on family connections. The pattern was becoming clear. Grandfather had been generous but strategic, providing for everyone according to their relationship with him and their perceived needs or contributions. The numbers were substantial enough to ensure comfortable lives but not so large as to remove incentive for personal achievement. To my son Robert Hartwell, I leave the sum of $15 million, along with the beach house in Myrtle Beach and the cabin in Asheville, recognizing his lifelong loyalty to the family business despite his challenges with personal responsibility. Robert's face went through several expressions: surprise, gratitude, and what might have been relief. $15 million was enough to secure his future and probably cover any outstanding debts he'd accumulated through his various failed ventures and expensive divorces. To my granddaughter Victoria Harrison, I leave the sum of $20 million, along with the townhouse in Charleston and the jewelry collection that belonged to her grandmother, in recognition of her dedication to preserving family traditions and social standing. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Victoria's smile was radiant. $20 million plus property and jewelry would maintain her lifestyle indefinitely and secure her position in the social circles she'd worked so hard to penetrate through marriage and charity work. The room had grown, quieter as the stakes became apparent. Morrison was working his way through the family hierarchy, and the amounts were substantial enough to change lives significantly. But the biggest prize hadn't been mentioned yet: control of Hartwell Industries itself, the company that generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue and employed thousands of people across the Southeast. To my grandson, Marcus Wellington Hartwell, Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of the moment everyone had been waiting for, who has demonstrated his commitment to continuing the family business legacy, I leave the sum of $30 million, along with the primary family residence and grounds and... Marcus sat forward slightly, his eyes bright with anticipation. This was the moment he'd been preparing for his entire life, the formal transfer of power that would make him the unquestioned head of the Hartwell empire. A position on the board of directors of Hartwell Industries, with voting rights equivalent to a 15% ownership stake in the company. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and growing anger. 15%? He managed. Harold, there must be some mistake. I was supposed to inherit controlling interest in the company. Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral. The will is quite specific, Marcus. 15% voting stake, along with the other provisions I mentioned. But that's not controlling interest, Victoria said, her voice sharp with the same confusion that was evident on Marcus's face. Who has controlling interest? Eleanor leaned forward, her hawk-like gaze fixed on Morrison. Harold, Thomas, and I discussed this many times over the years. The business was always meant to stay in the family, with Marcus taking over as his grandfather intended. What aren't you telling us? Morrison glanced at his associate, Sarah Chen, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The disposition of the controlling interest in Hartwell Industries is addressed in a separate provision of the will. What separate provision? Marcus demanded, his composure finally cracking. I've been groomed for this role my entire life. I've worked at the company for 12 years, learned every aspect of the business. Grandfather always said, what your grandfather said and what he ultimately decided were apparently two different things, Morrison replied gently. The controlling interest in Hartwell Industries, 51% of voting shares, has been left to... He paused, his eyes moving around the table before settling on me. Every face in the room turned to follow his gaze, expressions of shock and disbelief etched on features that had been confident just moments before. To Jessica Marie Hartwell, along with the position of Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the board, effective immediately upon the reading of this will. The explosion of voices was immediate and deafening. Marcus shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. That's impossible! Jessica hasn't worked for the company a day in her life. She doesn't know anything about the business. This is preposterous, Eleanor declared, her voice cutting through the chaos. Thomas would never leave his life's work to someone who abandoned the family. There must be an error, Harold. Victoria was staring at me with undisguised hostility. She can't just waltz back in here after 15 years and take over everything our grandfather built. This has to be contested. This isn't what he wanted. Robert looked bewildered, glancing between me and Morrison as if trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Patricia kept checking her phone as if she expected the inheritance amounts to change. Madison had actually put her device down and was paying attention for perhaps the first time in years. Through it all, I sat frozen in my chair, unable to process what I'd just heard. Controlling interest in Hartwell Industries, CEO, chairman of the board. These weren't roles you inherited like jewelry or vacation homes. These were positions that required knowledge, experience, and the respect of employees and business partners. I need to see the document, Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. I need to see exactly what it says, because this makes no sense. Morrison handed him the relevant pages of the will. Marcus scanned them quickly, his face growing paler with each line. He passed the pages to Victoria, who read them with the same expression of growing horror. It's all here, Victoria said, her voice hollow. Control of the company, the CEO position, even the responsibility for all employee pension funds and benefits. Everything goes to Jessica. But why? Madison asked, speaking for the first time since the reading had begun. I mean, no offense, Jessica, but you haven't been part of the family for years. Why would Grandpa Thomas leave you everything? It was a fair question, and one I couldn't answer. 15 years ago, my grandfather and I had parted in anger and disappointment. I'd built a life 3,000 miles away, written 4 novels that had achieved modest success, and avoided family gatherings and business discussions. I'd assumed I'd been written out of the will entirely, let alone named as the heir to the entire business empire. There has to be more, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers. Thomas wouldn't make a decision this significant without explanation. Harold, what else is in that file? Morrison looked uncomfortable, for the first time since the reading had begun. He glanced again at Sarah Chen, who opened her own portfolio and withdrew another document. This one was thinner than the will, bound in simple manila covers rather than the formal blue binding. There is an accompanying letter, Morrison admitted. Thomas instructed me to read it only if questions arose about his decisions regarding the business. Questions have arisen, Marcus said grimly. Read it. Morrison opened the letter, and I could see my grandfather's distinctive handwriting on the pale blue stationery he'd used for personal correspondence throughout my childhood. The sight of those familiar loops and angles made my throat tighten, with unexpected emotion. To my family, Morrison began, reading my grandfather's words. If you are hearing this letter, it means you are questioning my decision to name Jessica as my successor at Hartwell Industries. I understand your confusion, and I hope this explanation will provide the clarity you seek. The room had fallen completely silent. Even Patricia had stopped checking her phone, and Timothy had straightened in his chair with interest. When Jessica left 15 years ago, I was angry and disappointed. I felt she was rejecting everything I had worked to build, choosing her own interests over family responsibility. I said things I regretted, and I believe she did as well. The distance between us seemed unbridgeable. I felt tears threatening, and blinked them back. This wasn't the time for emotion, not with 11 pairs of eyes watching my every reaction. However, over the past several years, I have had occasion to observe Jessica's life and choices from a distance. What I discovered changed my understanding of both her character and her capabilities. Morrison paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. What I discovered is that Jessica has been far more involved in our family's business than any of you realize, in ways that demonstrate both her business acumen and her commitment to the values I tried to instill in all of you. Marcus leaned forward. What does that mean? How? Morrison continued reading. The truth is, Jessica has been helping to save Hartwell Industries for the past 5 years, using knowledge and skills none of you knew she possessed. She has been the invisible hand guiding several crucial decisions that kept our company profitable during some very challenging periods. The room erupted again, but this time the voices were confused rather than angry. How could I have been involved in business decisions when I lived across the country and hadn't spoken to my grandfather in years? That's impossible, Victoria declared. We would have known if Jessica was involved in company business. The board would have known. We would have seen her at meetings, received reports. Morrison held up his hand for silence, then continued reading. What none of you realized is that the successful turnaround of our textile division 3 years ago, the strategic acquisition of Morrison Manufacturing, and the development of our sustainable materials program all came about through advice and analysis provided by Jessica, though she never knew she was helping the family business. I felt the blood drain from my face as the pieces began falling into place. The consulting work I'd been doing, the anonymous client who'd hired me through a series of intermediaries, the complex business analyses I'd prepared without ever knowing the identity of the company I was helping. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Jessica has demonstrated a level of financial acumen and strategic thinking that surpasses what I've seen from any other family member. She has built her own successful business, managed complex investments, and shown the kind of analytical skills that will be essential for Hartwell Industries' future. What business? Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. Jessica writes books. She's not a businesswoman. But I was beginning to understand what my grandfather had discovered and why he'd made the decision that was shocking everyone in this room. The consulting firm I'd built over the past 8 years. The strategic analysis work that had allowed me to buy my house in Carmel and fund my writing career. The complex financial structures I'd learned to navigate as an independent contractor, working with Fortune 500 companies. I'd been hiding in plain sight, building exactly the kind of expertise that would qualify someone to run a major corporation, while my family assumed I was barely making ends meet as a struggling novelist. There's more, Morrison said, turning to a second page of the letter. But before I continue, I think Jessica should have the opportunity to explain how she's been involved in consulting work that, unknown to her, has been helping to guide Hartwell Industries' strategy for the past 5 years. All eyes turned to me again, but this time the expressions were different. Instead of dismissal and condescension, I saw calculation, concern, and the dawning realization that they might have seriously underestimated the family member they'd written off 15 years ago. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would change the dynamic in this room forever, and probably determine whether my grandfather's final wishes would be honored or challenged in court for years to come. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me as the weight of what I was about to reveal settled on my shoulders. For 8 years, I'd maintained careful boundaries between my consulting work and my personal life. I'd used different business entities, worked through intermediaries, and never asked too many questions about my clients' identities. It had been a deliberate choice. I wanted my success to be my own, untainted by family connections or the Hartwell name. Now I realized that my grandfather had been orchestrating something far more complex than I'd ever imagined. 5 years ago, I began, my voice stronger than I felt. I was approached by a consulting firm in Atlanta called Strategic Solutions Group. They needed someone with expertise in operational efficiency and market analysis for what they described as a mid-sized manufacturing company facing competitive pressures. Marcus scoffed. Consulting? Jessica, we're talking about running $1 billion corporation, not writing reports for small businesses. Let me finish, I said firmly, surprised by the authority in my own voice. The project was extensive, a complete analysis of the company's textile operations, recommendations for modernizing production facilities, and a strategic plan for transitioning to sustainable materials. The work took 6 months and required me to become an expert in industrial textiles, supply chain management, and environmental regulations. Sarah Chen had been taking notes throughout my explanation, her expression professionally neutral but alert. "What were your recommendations?" she asked. "Complete restructuring of the production line to eliminate waste, renegotiation of supplier contracts to reduce raw material costs by 18%, and development of a new product line, focused on eco-friendly fabrics." I looked directly at Marcus. The client implemented every recommendation. The division went from losing money to generating $40 million in annual profit within 2 years. Victoria was staring at me with dawning comprehension. The textile division turnaround, that was your work? Apparently so, though I only learned the client's identity 5 minutes ago. Robert leaned forward, his expression more engaged than I'd seen since entering the room. What about Morrison Manufacturing? The letter mentioned a strategic acquisition. I felt my cheeks flush as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. 2 years ago, Strategic Solutions Group hired me again. This time to evaluate a potential acquisition target. A small manufacturing company with outdated equipment, but valuable patents and an experienced workforce. The analysis was incredibly detailed. I spent 3 weeks on site, reviewing their operations, interviewing employees, and assessing their technology. Morrison Manufacturing, Timothy said quietly. That acquisition saved 200 jobs and gave us access to specialized production capabilities we couldn't develop in-house. The recommendation was to acquire the company but invest heavily in equipment upgrades and employee training, I continued. The projected return on investment was substantial, but only if the new owners were committed to long-term development, rather than quick profits. Eleanor's expression had shifted from hostile to calculating. You're saying you've been working for Hartwell Industries without knowing it? Not directly for Hartwell. For Strategic Solutions Group, which I now suspect was a consulting firm hired by grandfather to get independent analysis without the bias that might come from family involvement or internal politics. Morrison cleared his throat. That's correct. Thomas established Strategic Solutions Group 5 years ago specifically to obtain objective business advice. He felt that family dynamics and company politics were preventing him from getting honest assessments of the business challenges Hartwell Industries was facing. Marcus stood abruptly, beginning to pace behind his chair. So, you're telling me that while I was working 70-hour weeks trying to keep the company profitable, grandfather was secretly hiring my sister to second-guess my decisions? Not second-guess, I replied carefully. The projects I worked on were presented as opportunities for improvement, not criticisms of existing management. I never knew I was evaluating decisions you'd made. But you were undermining my authority, Marcus shot back. Every recommendation you made was an implicit criticism of how I was running things. Actually, Sarah Chen interjected, consulting. Her notes. The documentation suggests that many of Jessica's recommendations complemented existing initiatives rather than replacing them. The Sustainable Materials Program, for instance, built on research that Marcus had already begun. This was news to me. You were already working on sustainable materials? Marcus stopped pacing, his expression grudging. I'd identified it as a growth opportunity, but I couldn't get board approval for the initial investment. Too many members thought it was a fad that would pass. My analysis showed that sustainable materials would be mandatory for government contracts within 5 years, I said. The companies that developed expertise early would have a significant competitive advantage. Which is exactly what happened, Robert added. We landed 3 major government contracts last year, specifically because of our sustainable materials capabilities. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Rather than working against each other, Marcus and I had been unknowingly collaborating on the strategic direction of the company. My independent analysis had provided the external validation needed to move forward with initiatives that Marcus had identified but couldn't implement due to family politics and board resistance. There's something else, Morrison said, returning to my grandfather's letter. Thomas wanted you to understand the full scope of Jessica's qualifications before making any judgments about his decision. He turned to a new page. Over the past 8 years, Jessica has built Hartwell Strategic Consulting into a firm that serves 12 Fortune 500 companies. Her client list includes 3 companies larger than Hartwell Industries, and her recommendations have generated over $200 million in documented cost savings and revenue improvements. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after the will reading. This was the silence of people reassessing everything they thought they knew. Hartwell Strategic Consulting? Victoria asked. You named your company after the family? I started using the Hartwell name professionally about 6 years ago, I admitted. Not because I wanted to trade on family connections, but because I was proud of the work ethic and values I'd learned growing up. I thought I could honor the family legacy, even if I wasn't part of the family business. Eleanor's expression had undergone a complete transformation. The dismissive hostility had been replaced by sharp professional interest. What kind of companies? What industries? Manufacturing, primarily, but also logistics, technology, and renewable energy. I specialized in helping traditional companies adapt to changing market conditions and regulatory requirements. Show me, Marcus said suddenly. He pulled out his phone and began typing. Hartwell Strategic Consulting. Let me see what Google says about my sister's secret business empire. The next few minutes were uncomfortable as various family members began searching for information about my company online. I'd always maintained a professional website and LinkedIn presence, but I'd never discussed my work with family members who'd shown no interest in my life after I left North Carolina. Jesus Christ, Marcus muttered, staring at his phone screen. Forbes named you one of the top strategic consultants under 40. When was this? 2 years ago, I said quietly. It was a nice recognition, but I've always preferred to let the work speak for itself. Harvard Business Review, Victoria read from her own phone. Case study on innovative approaches to manufacturing optimization. Jessica Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Strategic Consulting. She looked up at me with something approaching respect. This article has been cited in academic journals. Timothy was grinning openly now. Cousin Jessica, you've been holding out on us. Listen to this. Hartwell's methodology combines traditional operational analysis with cutting-edge sustainability frameworks, creating solutions that improve both profitability and environmental impact. I don't understand, Madison said, looking genuinely confused. If you're this successful, why didn't you ever tell us? Why let everyone think you were just a struggling writer? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since Morrison had begun reading the will. Because every time I came home, the conversation was about how I'd disappointed the family by not joining the business. Nobody ever asked what I was actually doing with my life. It was easier to let people think what they wanted to think. But you were succeeding on your own terms, Patricia observed. building exactly the kind of expertise that would qualify you to run a company like Hartwell Industries. I was building the life I wanted, I replied. Success in business was a means to support my writing, not an end in itself. I never thought about applying those skills to the family company because I assumed that bridge had been burned 15 years ago. Morrison was watching this exchange with interest, occasionally glancing at Sarah Chen, who continued taking detailed notes. "There's more to Thomas's letter," he said eventually. "He addresses the question of why he never told anyone about Jessica's involvement in the consulting projects." He returned to the letter. "I chose not to reveal Jessica's role in our business improvements because I wanted to see how the family would react to her success when it was presented without context. Would you recognize her capabilities and welcome her expertise? Or would you dismiss her achievements because they didn't fit your assumptions about her life choices?" The accusation in my grandfather's words hung heavy in the air. Everyone in the room knew the answer to his question. They'd dismissed me completely, never bothering to learn what I'd accomplished or what I might contribute to the family business. "That seems manipulative," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Perhaps," Morrison continued reading. "But it was also necessary. The family business faces challenges that will require innovative thinking and fresh perspectives. Jessica has demonstrated both the technical expertise and the independence of thought that will be essential for Hartwell Industries' survival in a changing marketplace." Marcus had stopped pacing and was standing with his hands braced against the back of his chair. "So this whole thing was a test? Grandfather's final exam to see if we'd recognize Jessica's qualifications?" "It appears so," Morrison replied, "though I don't think Thomas expected the family dynamics to be quite so pronounced." "What does that mean?" Robert asked. Sarah Chen spoke up for the first time since introducing herself. "Mr. Hartwell left. Additional instructions about the transition process. He anticipated that there might be resistance to Jessica taking over the company, particularly from family members who felt they deserved those roles." She opened another folder and withdrew. A document I hadn't seen before. "He established a 6-month transition period, during which Jessica will work alongside Marcus to learn the operational aspects of the business while maintaining her independent consulting work. If, at the end of 6 months, the board of directors determines that she's not qualified for the CEO position, control of the company will transfer to Marcus." This was news to everyone, including Morrison, who was reading over Sarah's shoulder with evident surprise. "When was this addendum prepared?" he asked. 2 weeks before Mr. Hartwell's death," Sarah replied. "He asked me to prepare it separately and present it only if the family situation required additional structure for the transition." Marcus straightened slowly, hope flickering in his expression. 6 months? A trial period? "More than that," Sarah continued. "During the transition period, Jessica will receive a salary equal to the CEO position, but Marcus will retain his current authority over day-to-day operations. They'll essentially be co-running the company, with Jessica focusing on strategic planning and Marcus handling operational management." "And if Jessica proves herself capable?" Victoria asked. "Then she becomes CEO as originally planned, with Marcus taking the position of Chief Operating Officer at a substantial salary increase." "And if she doesn't?" "Then Marcus becomes CEO, Jessica retains her 15% ownership stake and a e.g. permanent seat on the board of directors, and the family business continues under traditional leadership." The room was quiet as everyone processed this information. What had seemed like an impossible situation, a family outsider suddenly inheriting control of a billion-dollar company, now appeared to be a carefully structured transition plan designed to give everyone a chance to adapt to new realities. "It's actually brilliant," Timothy said admiringly. "Grandfather gets to test whether Jessica can handle the operational challenges of running the company, while giving Marcus a chance to prove he can work collaboratively with someone who might have different ideas about business strategy. It's also fair," Patricia added. "Jessica gets a real opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities, But she doesn't just get handed control without earning it. Eleanor was studying the addendum with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades analyzing legal documents for potential advantages. What happens to the rest of the inheritance during this transition period? All other provisions of the will take effect immediately, Morrison replied. Only control of the company is subject to the 6-month evaluation period. Madison looked up from her phone, where she'd apparently been continuing her research into my consulting business. Jessica, it says here that you've worked with 3 companies that compete directly with Hartwell Industries. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest? It was an astute question, and one I'd been wondering about myself. I've always maintained strict confidentiality agreements with my clients. I would never share proprietary information between competing companies. But you'd have insights into their strategies, their strengths and weaknesses, Marcus pointed out. That could be valuable intelligence for Hartwell Industries. It could also be an ethical violation of my professional responsibilities, I replied firmly. If I'm going to work with Hartwell Industries, I'll need to establish clear boundaries about what information I can and cannot use from my previous consulting work. Sarah Chen made another note. That's something we'll need to address in the transition agreements. Professional ethics and confidentiality requirements will need to be clearly defined. Morrison was gathering the various documents spread across the table. I think we've covered the major points for today. Jessica, you'll need time to consider whether you want to accept the terms of your grandfather's bequest. The transition period is optional. You could simply decline the inheritance if you prefer to continue your current life in California. The option hadn't occurred to me. In the space of an hour, I'd gone from being the excluded family member to inheriting control of a billion-dollar company. But I could still walk away, return to my quiet life in Carmel, continue writing novels and consulting for other companies. How long do I have to decide? I asked. 30 days, Morrison replied. Though the sooner you decide, the better for everyone involved. If you're going to participate in the transition period, it should begin as soon as possible. Marcus was watching me intently. What are you thinking, Jessica? Are you seriously considering this? I looked around the room at the faces of family, members I'd barely spoken to in 15 years. Some were hostile, some calculating, some curious. But for the first time since I'd walked through that door, I didn't see dismissal or condescension. They were seeing me as a person with capabilities and choices, not just the family disappointment who'd run off to pursue artistic dreams. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that maybe grandfather knew something about me that I'm just beginning to understand myself. The meeting at Morrison, Bradley and Associates had ended with more questions than answers. I'd been given 30 days to decide whether to accept my grandfather's offer, a chance to prove myself worthy of inheriting his life's work. But as I sat in my rental car outside the law office, staring at the familiar skyline of Charlotte where I'd grown up, I found myself thinking not about the future, but about the path that had brought me to this impossible moment. 15 years. That's how long it had been since I'd stormed out of my grandfather's study, tears streaming down my face, after the argument that severed our relationship. I could still remember every word of that confrontation, every disappointed look, every accusation that I was throwing away my responsibilities for selfish, artistic dreams. What none of them knew, what I'd never told anyone, was that leaving North Carolina hadn't been an impulsive decision driven by creative passion. It had been an escape from a life that was slowly suffocating me, from expectations that felt like a straitjacket, and from the growing realization that I didn't fit the mold the Hartwell family had created for their daughters. The drive to my hotel took me past familiar landmarks that stirred memories I'd spent years trying to suppress. There was the country club where I'd been forced to attend cotillion classes at 16, learning to curtsy and make polite conversation while secretly reading business journals under the table. The private academy where I'd graduated valedictorian, but had been discouraged from pursuing advanced mathematics because young ladies from good families don't need to worry about such things. The boutique where my mother had taken me shopping for appropriate clothes, meaning conservative dresses that made me look like a younger version of the society wives I was expected to become. But it was driving past the Hartwell Industries headquarters that really brought back the memories. The imposing brick building where I'd spent summers during high school, supposedly learning the family business, but actually being relegated to filing and fetching coffee for executives who treated me like an amusing mascot rather than a potential future leader. My phone rang as I pulled into the hotel parking lot. The caller ID showed a California number I recognized, my assistant, Claire, checking in from my office in Carmel. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble. Claire had been with me for 4 years and knew better than most how complicated my relationship with my family had become. "It went unexpectedly," I replied, not sure how to summarize the morning's revelations. "Claire, I need you to do something for me. Pull together a complete portfolio of our work over the past 8 years. Client testimonials, project outcomes, financial performance, everything. And see if you can get me copies of the articles and case studies that have been published about our methodology." "Are you planning to look for new clients? Because your calendar is already booked through next spring." "I might be looking at a very different kind of opportunity," I said carefully. "I'll explain when I get back to California, but I need to see our track record laid out comprehensively. I want to understand what we've built." After ending the call, I sat in my car for several more minutes, remembering the chain of events that had led me to build Hartwell Strategic Consulting in the first place. It hadn't started as a business plan or even a career aspiration. It had started as survival. When I arrived in California 15 years ago with my Columbia MFA and a burning desire to write the great American novel, I'd quickly discovered that artistic ambition didn't pay rent. The fellowship I'd received to attend a writer's residency in Monterey had provided 6 months of housing and a small stipend, but after that, I was on my own. I'd taken whatever work I could find, waitressing, tutoring, even a brief stint as a dog walker for wealthy tech executives in Silicon Valley. But it was the tutoring work that had accidentally launched my consulting career. One of my students was the daughter of a manufacturing executive who was struggling with a business problem. His company was losing money on a production line that seemed efficient on paper, but was somehow generating excessive waste. I'd listened to him explain the problem over coffee one afternoon while waiting for his daughter to finish her SAT prep session. Something about the situation reminded me of a case study I'd analyzed in an economics class at Columbia. On an impulse, I'd asked if I could see the production data. What I found was a classic optimization problem disguised as an operational mystery. The production line was technically efficient, but the scheduling was all wrong. They were switching between product types too frequently, creating setup costs and waste that wiped out the gains from their expensive new equipment. I'd written up my analysis over a weekend, treating it like a creative writing exercise. A story about why a seemingly successful system was failing. The executive had implemented my recommendations and saved his company $800,000 in the first year. Word had spread through Silicon Valley's tight network of manufacturing companies. Within 6 months, I was getting calls from executives who needed someone to look at their operations with fresh eyes, someone who wasn't locked into traditional approaches or invested in defending existing systems. I'd started charging for my time, initially just enough to support my writing while I worked on my first novel. But the projects kept getting more complex and more lucrative. Companies were willing to pay substantial fees for analyses that could save them millions in operational costs or help them identify new market opportunities. The breakthrough had come 3 years after moving to California, when a renewable energy startup had hired me to evaluate whether they should build their own manufacturing facility or continue outsourcing production. The project had required me to become an expert in solar panel manufacturing, supply chain logistics, and environmental regulations. It was the most complex analysis I'd ever undertaken, and it had taken 4 months of intensive research and on-site investigation. My recommendation had been counterintuitive. Instead of building their own facility, they should acquire a struggling, traditional manufacturer and retrofit it for renewable energy production. The approach would cost less than new construction, preserve existing jobs, and give them access to skilled workers who understood manufacturing processes. The client had followed my advice and tripled their production capacity while reducing costs by 30%. They'd also offered me a full-time position as their head of strategic planning, which I'd turned down because I was still committed to my writing career. But the project had taught me something important about my own capabilities. I had a talent for seeing patterns that others missed, for identifying inefficiencies and opportunities that weren't obvious to people too close to the problems. I could synthesize information from multiple sources and create strategic frameworks that translated complex business challenges into actionable solutions. More importantly, I enjoyed the work. The intellectual challenge of understanding how systems functioned, the satisfaction of solving puzzles that had stumped experienced executives, the creative process of designing solutions that addressed both immediate problems and long-term, strategic goals. By my 5th year in California, I'd published 2 novels and built a consulting practice that generated more revenue than my book royalties. I'd started hiring other consultants, developing proprietary analytical tools, and establishing relationships with implementation partners who could help clients execute the strategies I developed. The decision to formally establish Hartwell Strategic Consulting had been both practical and emotional. Practical because I needed a corporate structure to handle the growing complexity of my business. Emotional because I wanted to honor the values my grandfather had taught me about hard work, integrity, and excellence, even if I couldn't honor them within the family business. I'd chosen the tagline, Strategic Solutions for Adaptive Enterprise, because it captured what I'd learned about helping companies navigate change. The most successful organizations weren't necessarily the ones with the best initial strategies, but the ones that could adapt quickly when circumstances shifted. Looking back now, I could see how every project had built on the previous ones, creating a body of expertise that was uniquely valuable in an economy where traditional industries were being disrupted by new technologies and changing consumer preferences. I'd helped a textile company transition to producing medical fabrics, guided a furniture manufacturer through automation without eliminating jobs, and advised 3 different companies on how to meet increasingly strict environmental regulations, while maintaining profitability. What I hadn't realized was how directly relevant this experience would be to the challenges facing Hartwell Industries. My grandfather's company was exactly the kind of traditional manufacturer that needed to adapt to survive. The textile division that my analysis had helped turn around, the sustainable materials program that had won government contracts, the acquisition of Morrison Manufacturing. All of these were examples of the adaptive strategies I'd been developing and refining for years. My phone buzzed with a text message from Timothy. Coffee tomorrow? I have some things I'd like to discuss about the family situation. Also, I looked up your consulting firm. Very impressive. I stared at the message, realizing that my cousin represented something I hadn't expected to find in Charlotte, an ally. Timothy had always been the family rebel, choosing art over business and maintaining his independence despite the pressure to conform to family expectations. If anyone would understand the path I'd taken, it would be him. Texted back, yes to coffee, and thank you for the support during the meeting today. It meant more than you know. His response came quickly. Family dynamics are complicated, but talent is talent. Looking forward to hearing your perspective on some things. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with my laptop, reviewing the materials Claire had sent from California. The portfolio was more impressive than I'd expected. Over 8 years, Hartwell Strategic Consulting had worked with 47 companies, generated documented savings of over $200 million, and maintained a client retention rate of 85%. The case studies were particularly revealing. I'd helped a struggling steel company avoid bankruptcy by identifying new market opportunities in renewable energy infrastructure. I'd guided a traditional retailer through the transition to e-commerce, preserving most of their workforce while dramatically expanding their market reach. I'd advised a family-owned construction company on how to compete with larger firms by specializing in sustainable building practices. In every case, the challenge had been the same: how to help established companies adapt to changing conditions without losing their core identity or competitive advantages. The solutions had always been complex, requiring deep understanding of both the industry specifics and the broader economic forces driving change. What struck me most was how many of the challenges were identical to what Hartwell Industries had been facing. Traditional manufacturing companies are struggling with global competition, environmental regulations, changing customer preferences, and the need to attract younger workers who expect different things from their employers. I'd been preparing for this opportunity my entire career without realizing it. The next morning, I met Timothy at a coffee shop near downtown Charlotte. He'd chosen a place that was clearly not part of the family's usual social circuit, a converted warehouse space filled with local artists and young professionals rather than the country club crowd I'd grown up with. "I've been thinking about yesterday," he said after we'd ordered our coffee, "about grandfather's plan and what it means for the family dynamics." "What's your assessment?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "I think he was brilliant," Timothy replied, "and I think he understood something about you that the rest of the family missed completely." He pulled out his phone and showed me an article he'd bookmarked. "This interview you did with Harvard Business Review 2 years ago. You said something that stuck with me. The most successful transformations happen when companies honor their heritage while embracing innovation. The challenge isn't choosing between tradition and change, it's finding ways to make them work together." I remembered that interview. It had been one of the few times I'd spoken publicly about my consulting philosophy, and I'd been nervous about revealing too much about my approach. "That's exactly what Hartwell Industries needs," Timothy continued. "Marcus is excellent at preserving tradition and maintaining operational stability, but he's not good at driving innovation or adapting to change. You have the opposite skill set. Together, you might actually be able to create something neither of you could accomplish alone." "Assuming we can work together," I said. "Yesterday's meeting didn't exactly suggest natural collaboration." Timothy grinned. "Marcus is going to surprise you. He's not as rigid as he seems. The reason he's been so focused on traditional approaches is that he's been scared of making mistakes that would damage grandfather's legacy. If he has a partner who can help him take calculated risks, he might turn out to be more adaptable than anyone expects." It was an intriguing perspective and one that made me think about the transition period in a different light. Instead of viewing it as a test I had to pass, maybe I should see it as an opportunity to build a partnership that could strengthen the company regardless of who ultimately became CEO. "There's something else," Timothy said, his expression becoming more serious. "I've been doing some research into the family finances, and I think there are challenges that weren't discussed yesterday. Challenges that make your expertise even more valuable than anyone realized." He pulled out a folder filled with financial documents and news articles. "Hartwell Industries is profitable, but it's not as stable as everyone thinks. And there are some family financial issues that could affect the company's future in ways that might surprise you." Looking at the documents he'd compiled, I began to understand that my grandfather's decision to name me as his heir might have been driven by more than just recognition of my capabilities. It might have been motivated by urgent business needs that required exactly the kind of adaptive strategic thinking I'd been developing for the past 8 years. The question was whether I was ready to apply those skills to the most complex challenge of my career, saving not just a company, but a family legacy that I'd never been sure I wanted to inherit. The documents Timothy had spread across the coffee table painted a picture that was far more complex than anything discussed in the lawyer's office. Financial statements, board meeting minutes, news clippings, and what appeared to be private correspondence between my grandfather and various business associates created a narrative that made my inheritance seem less like a family reconciliation and more like a strategic necessity. This started about 3 years ago, Timothy explained, pointing to a quarterly report from Hartwell Industries. The company was profitable, but the profit margins were shrinking. Traditional textile manufacturing was becoming increasingly commoditized, and our major competitors were either moving production overseas or investing heavily in automation. I studied the numbers, recognizing the pattern I'd seen in dozens of consulting projects. Companies that appeared healthy on the surface, but were actually being gradually undermined by structural changes in their industries. What was grandfather's response? That's where it gets interesting, Timothy said, pulling out a series of internal memos. Instead of following Marcus's recommendations for cost-cutting and workforce reduction, grandfather started making what seemed like eccentric decisions. He hired Strategic Solutions Group, your consulting firm, though none of us knew it, and began implementing changes that didn't fit any obvious pattern. The memos were fascinating. My grandfather had been methodically documenting his decision-making process, creating a paper trail that showed how each strategic shift had been carefully calculated rather than impulsive. The textile division restructuring, the Morrison manufacturing acquisition, the sustainable materials program. All of these had been part of a comprehensive transformation plan that was more sophisticated than I'd realized. He was essentially running 2 companies, I said, beginning to understand the scope of what my grandfather had accomplished. The visible Hartwell Industries that the family and the board understood, and a parallel strategic operation that was preparing for the future. Exactly. And he was funding the strategic operation through a series of what he called special projects that were never fully explained to the board or the family. Timothy handed me another set of documents: financial transfers, consulting fees, and equipment purchases that totaled several $1,000,000 over 3 years. All of it had been authorized by my grandfather personally, using discretionary funds that were part of his CEO authority, but were substantial enough to affect the company's overall financial position. Where did he get this kind of discretionary funding? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. That's the complicated part, Timothy replied, his expression growing serious. He was essentially borrowing against future profits, using his personal assets as collateral. The beach house in Myrtle Beach, the cabin in Asheville, even part of his stake in the main family residence, all of it was pledged to secure loans that funded the company's transformation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather hadn't just been implementing strategic changes. He'd been betting his personal fortune on the belief that those changes would work. If the transformation had failed, he would have lost not just the company but virtually everything the family owned. Does anyone else know about this? I asked. Marcus suspects something, but he doesn't have the full picture. The board knows about some of the special projects, but they think they were funded through normal operational cash flow. Only grandfather and Harold Morrison knew the complete financial structure. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. My grandfather's decision to name me as his heir wasn't just about recognizing my capabilities or healing family relationships. It was about ensuring that someone with the right expertise would be in position to manage the consequences of his high-stakes gamble. Timothy, what happens if the transformation doesn't generate the projected returns? What happens to the family's financial security? He was quiet for a moment, organizing another set of documents. That's the question that kept grandfather awake at night during his final months. The loans he secured have balloon payments coming due over the next 3 years. If Hartwell Industries doesn't maintain its current profitability levels and continue growing, the family could lose everything. The weight of responsibility I'd felt after yesterday's reading suddenly became much heavier. This wasn't about proving myself worthy of inheriting a successful company. This was about saving my family, From potential financial ruin caused by my grandfather's desperate attempt to ensure the company's survival. There's more, Timothy continued, pulling out what appeared to be personal correspondence. Grandfather was tracking the performance of every company you'd consulted for. He had detailed reports on their financial outcomes, their operational improvements, their strategic positioning after implementing your recommendations. The letters were written in my grandfather's precise handwriting, addressed to Harold Morrison and marked Confidential Estate Planning. They documented a level of research into my consulting work that was both flattering and slightly unsettling. Listen to this, Timothy said, reading from one of the letters. Jessica's methodology consistently produces results that exceed initial projections. Her clients averaged 23% improvement in operational efficiency within the first year, and 67% report sustained competitive advantages after 3 years. More importantly, her recommendations show unusual sensitivity to workforce preservation and community impact, values that align with Hartwell Industries' traditional approach to business. I felt a strange mix of pride and unease. My grandfather had been monitoring my career more closely than I'd monitored some of my own clients. But here's the really interesting part, Timothy continued. He wasn't just evaluating your consulting work, he was testing it. What do you mean? Timothy handed me another document, a consulting agreement between Strategic Solutions Group and a small manufacturing company in Georgia called Piedmont Textiles. The project description was familiar: operational analysis, efficiency improvements, strategic recommendations for market expansion. Piedmont Textiles, Timothy said, is owned by one of grandfather's old business associates. The consulting project you completed for them 2 years ago wasn't initiated by their management. It was commissioned by my grandfather, who wanted to see how your recommendations would work for a company that was similar to Hartwell Industries, but smaller and less complex. I stared at the document, remembering the project clearly. Piedmont had been struggling with aging equipment and declining market share, but they had a skilled workforce and strong relationships with regional customers. My recommendations had focused on modernizing their production capabilities while leveraging their reputation for quality and customer service. What were the results? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Piedmont's revenue increased by 35% in the first year after implementing your recommendations. They expanded their workforce by 20 people and secured 3 major new contracts. Grandfather used their success as a proof of concept for some of the changes he was making at Hartwell Industries. The revelation was both impressive and troubling. My grandfather had essentially been conducting a controlled experiment, using another company to test my strategies before applying them to his own business. It showed remarkable confidence in my abilities, but it also suggested a level of strategic manipulation that was uncomfortable to contemplate. There's one more thing, Timothy said, his voice becoming hesitant. Something I'm not sure how to interpret. He pulled out a folder that was thicker than the others, filled with what appeared to be surveillance reports and private investigator documents. My name appeared on multiple pages, along with photos I hadn't known were being taken, and detailed summaries of my daily activities. He was having me? I asked, feeling a chill of invasion. Not watched exactly, more like documented. He wanted to understand how you lived, what your priorities were, whether your business success was sustainable or just a lucky streak. The reports were comprehensive and surprisingly respectful. They documented my work, habits, my client relationships, my financial management, and my personal life without being judgmental or intrusive. The overall picture they painted was of someone who was disciplined, ethical, successful, and genuinely committed to helping her clients achieve their objectives. But there was something else in the reports that caught my attention. References to meetings and phone calls with people whose names I didn't immediately recognize. Timothy, who is David Richardson? He looked at the name I was pointing to and frowned. I'm not sure. The name seems familiar, but I can't place it. Why? According to this report, I had lunch with him 3 times over the past year and several phone conversations. but I don't remember anyone by that name. Timothy was scanning through other documents, looking for additional references to Richardson. Here, he said, finding a business card attached to one of the surveillance reports. David Richardson, Senior Partner, Strategic Solutions Group. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. David Richardson wasn't someone I'd met, for personal reasons. He was the intermediary who'd been hiring me for the Hartwell Industries projects. The person I'd assumed was just another consulting firm partner was actually the link between my grandfather's strategic planning and my professional expertise. My grandfather was directly involved in hiring me, I said, the implications cascading through my mind. The projects weren't coming through Strategic Solutions Group's normal client development. They were coming specifically from him. Which means, Timothy said, understanding dawning on his face, that every piece of analysis you provided, every recommendation you made, was being implemented at Hartwell Industries not just because it was good advice, but because grandfather had specifically commissioned it. I felt simultaneously impressed by my grandfather's strategic thinking and manipulated by his elaborate deception. For 5 years, I'd believed I was building my consulting reputation through independent client relationships. Instead, I'd been unknowingly participating in an extended job interview for a position I hadn't known existed. The question is, Timothy continued, whether this changes how you feel about the inheritance. Does it matter that grandfather orchestrated your involvement in the company's transformation? It was a fair question, and one I wasn't sure how to answer. On one hand, the elaborate deception felt like a violation of my professional autonomy. On the other hand, the results spoke for themselves. My recommendations have helped save Hartwell Industries and position it for future growth. The methodology was sound regardless of how it had been commissioned. What matters, I said finally, is whether the family and the company can succeed going forward. The past is complicated, but it's the future that's at stake. Timothy nodded, but I could see he wasn't entirely satisfied with my response. There's one more piece of this puzzle, he said, pulling out a final document. Something my grandfather prepared that wasn't included in the will reading yesterday. The document was a letter addressed to me personally, sealed in an envelope marked, "To be opened only by Jessica Marie Hartwell, after she has learned the full scope of my strategic planning." My hands were trembling slightly as I opened it. The letter was shorter than I'd expected, written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting on his personal stationery. "My dear Jessica," it began, "if you are reading this letter, it means Timothy has shared with you the complete picture of what I've been attempting to accomplish over the past several years. I hope you will forgive the deception, but I needed to understand who you had become without the influence of family expectations or obligations." The letter continued. "What I discovered exceeded my hopes. You have built not just a successful business, but an approach to strategic thinking that honors both innovation and tradition. Your recommendations consistently achieve results while preserving the human elements that make businesses more than just profit-generating machines." I paused, feeling the weight of my grandfather's words and the complexity of emotions they stirred. The inheritance I've left you comes with obligations that extend beyond legal ownership. You are inheriting not just a company, but a legacy of responsibility to the families who depend on Hartwell Industries for their livelihoods. You are also inheriting the consequences of my gamble that transformation was possible without sacrificing our fundamental values. The final paragraph was the most personal. "I don't know if you will choose to accept this inheritance, but I hope you will understand that it represents not just my recognition of your capabilities, but my faith in your character. The family, business needs someone who can navigate change without losing sight of what makes us who we are. I believe you are that person." I set the letter down, aware that Timothy was watching my reaction carefully. The decision I'd thought I had 30 days to make was becoming clearer, though no less daunting. My grandfather hadn't just offered me an opportunity. He'd entrusted me with the future of everything he'd built and everyone who depended on it. "So," Timothy said quietly, What are you thinking? I looked at him across the table. This cousin, who'd become an unexpected ally, surrounded by the evidence of my grandfather's elaborate planning and desperate hope. I'm thinking, I said, that I need to understand exactly what I'd be walking into. And I'm thinking that maybe it's time I had a real conversation with Marcus about what we could accomplish together. The conversation with Marcus couldn't wait. After learning the true scope of my grandfather's financial gamble and the precarious position of the family's assets, I realized that the 6-month transition period wasn't just about proving my capabilities. It was about preventing a potential catastrophe that could destroy everything Thomas Hartwell had built over 7 decades. I called Marcus that evening, suggesting we meet privately before any formal transition process began. His initial response was cautious, but when I mentioned that I'd discovered some financial complexities that needed immediate attention, he agreed to meet me at the Hartwell Industries headquarters the next morning. The building looked different as I approached it this time. Instead of the imposing symbol of family legacy I'd always seen, it now appeared as a complex machine with thousands of moving parts, all dependent on decisions that would need to be made carefully and quickly. The weight of potential responsibility was becoming more real with each step I took toward the executive entrance. Marcus was waiting in his office, which occupied the corner suite that had once belonged to our grandfather. The space had been redecorated since Thomas's death, with Marcus's more modern aesthetic replacing the traditional furnishings I remembered from childhood visits. But the underlying authority of the room remained: floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manufacturing facilities, walls lined with awards and industry recognition, a massive desk that commanded respect. "Before we talk about anything else," Marcus said without preamble, "I need to understand something. Yesterday, you claimed you'd been unknowingly consulting for Hartwell Industries through Strategic Solutions Group. But how do I know this isn't part of some elaborate scheme you and grandfather cooked up to manipulate the family dynamics?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting. I pulled out the folder Timothy had given me, spreading the documents across Marcus's conference table. Because, until yesterday, I had no idea the Strategic Solutions Group was connected to my grandfather. And until this morning, I didn't know the full extent of what he'd been planning. I walked him through the evidence Timothy had compiled: the financial records showing Thomas's personal guarantees, the surveillance reports documenting my activities, the proof-of-concept testing at Piedmont Textiles. With each revelation, Marcus's expression shifted from suspicion to concern to something approaching alarm. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, studying the loan documents. "He leveraged the beach house, the cabin, part of the main estate?" According to these records, your grandfather put nearly everything at risk to fund the company's transformation. The balloon payments start coming due in 18 months. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the financial projections and payment schedules. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. "The company's current cash flow can cover the operational loans, but not these personal guarantees. If we have a bad quarter or lose a major contract, the family loses everything," I finished. "Which explains why grandfather didn't just leave you the company outright. He needed someone with specific expertise in business transformation and crisis management." "And you think you're that person?" Marcus asked, though his tone was more curious than challenging. I pulled out my laptop and opened the portfolio Claire had prepared. "Let me show you what I've actually accomplished over the past 8 years. Not just the projects I did for Hartwell Industries, but the full range of companies I've helped navigate similar challenges." For the next hour, I walked Marcus through case studies that demonstrated the methodology I'd developed for helping traditional manufacturers adapt to changing market conditions. The steel company that had avoided bankruptcy by pivoting to renewable energy infrastructure. The furniture manufacturer that had automated production while preserving jobs through retraining programs. The construction company that had transformed itself into a leader in sustainable building practices. "The pattern is consistent," I explained. "Companies that try to compete on cost alone usually fail when they're up against global competition. But companies that focus on innovation, quality, and specialized expertise can maintain premium pricing and strong profit margins. Marcus was taking notes, asking technical questions that showed he understood the strategic implications of what I was describing. This sustainable materials program we implemented, that was based on your analysis of market trends and regulatory changes? Yes, though I didn't know it at the time. The client was described as a regional manufacturer looking to diversify their product lines. I recommended focusing on eco-friendly materials because the regulatory environment was clearly moving in that direction, and early adopters would have significant competitive advantages. The government contracts we won last year, 3 of them specifically required sustainable materials compliance. Without that program, we wouldn't have been eligible to bid. I nodded, beginning to see how the pieces of my grandfather's strategy had fit together. He was positioning Hartwell Industries for opportunities that most competitors wouldn't be able to pursue. Instead of competing in commoditized markets, you'd be competing in specialized niches where expertise and compliance mattered more than pure cost. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the manufacturing floor where hundreds of employees were working their shifts. The workforce implications are significant, he said. If we'd followed the traditional cost-cutting approach, we would have eliminated maybe 30% of our jobs by now. Instead, we've actually been hiring people with specialized skills. That's intentional, I replied. One of the things I learned from studying manufacturing transformations is that companies that invest in their workforce during transitions typically outperform companies that treat employees as expendable costs. But it's also more expensive in the short term, Marcus pointed out. Training programs, higher wages for specialized skills, maintaining employment levels during modernization. All of that requires capital that might otherwise go to shareholders or debt reduction. Which brings us back to the financial pressure we're facing, I said. Your grandfather's loans are coming due, and the company needs to generate enough cash flow to cover both operational needs and debt service. Marcus returned to his desk, pulling out a different set of financial documents. I've been working on projections for the next 3 years. The good news is that our profit margins have improved significantly since implementing the changes grandfather commissioned. The bad news is that we're still not generating enough free cash flow to handle his personal debt obligations without compromising our ability to invest in continued growth. The numbers he showed me confirmed what I'd suspected. Hartwell Industries was more profitable than it had been in years, but the improvement wasn't dramatic enough to cover Thomas's gamble without additional strategic changes. What if we accelerated some of the transformation initiatives? I suggested. I've been looking at your current operations, and there are several areas where we could probably achieve faster improvements with more focused implementation. Such as? I pulled out my laptop again, opening a preliminary analysis I'd started working on after learning about the family's financial situation. The Morrison manufacturing acquisition has been successful, but you're not fully leveraging their specialized capabilities. They have expertise in precision components that could open up new markets in aerospace and medical devices. Marcus leaned forward, interested despite himself. We've discussed that possibility, but the certification requirements for those industries are extensive. It would take years to establish credibility with new customers. Not necessarily, I replied, switching to another section of my analysis. I've worked with 3 companies that successfully entered aerospace supply chains. The key is partnering with established prime contractors who can provide mentorship and credibility while you develop your capabilities. I showed him a case study from one of my California projects, a traditional manufacturer that had transitioned into aerospace components by forming joint ventures with larger companies. The approach had allowed them to access new markets while sharing the risks and costs of certification. The profit margins in aerospace components are substantially higher than traditional textiles, I continued. Even capturing a small share of that market could generate enough additional revenue to cover grandfather's debt obligations while funding continued growth. Marcus was studying the case study intently. What kind of timeline are we talking about? And what would be the capital requirements? Based on Morrison Manufacturing's current capabilities, probably 18 months to complete initial certifications and secure the first contracts. Capital requirements would be manageable. Maybe $2 million for equipment upgrades and certification processes. That's within our current capital budget, Marcus said, making more notes. What other opportunities have you identified? For the next 2 hours, we worked through a comprehensive analysis of Hartwell Industries' strategic options. I outlined possibilities for expanding the sustainable materials program, diversifying into new geographic markets, and developing proprietary technologies that could be licensed to other manufacturers. Marcus provided operational insights and financial constraints that helped refine each proposal into actionable plans. What surprised me was how naturally we worked together. Marcus's deep understanding of the company's operational realities complemented my strategic perspective, creating solutions that were both innovative and practical. The tension and suspicion from our initial conversation had been replaced by professional collaboration focused on solving shared problems. "This is remarkable work," Marcus said finally, reviewing the strategic plan we'd developed together. "If we can execute even half of these initiatives successfully, the financial pressure from grandfather's loans becomes manageable." "More than manageable," I replied. "Based on these projections, the company could actually emerge from this transition period stronger and more profitable than it's ever been." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then looked at me directly. "Jessica, I owe you an apology. Yesterday, I assumed you were getting something you hadn't earned. Now I'm beginning to understand that you might be inheriting a challenge that requires exactly the skills you've developed." "And I owe you an acknowledgement," I replied. "I assumed the family. Business was just about preserving tradition and maintaining the status quo. But you've been managing a complex transformation while protecting thousands of jobs and maintaining relationships with customers who've worked with Hartwell Industries for decades. That's not simple operational management. That's sophisticated leadership." "So, where does this leave us?" Marcus asked. "Are you planning to accept grandfather's bequest?" I looked around his office, thinking about everything I'd learned over the past 2 days. The financial risks were real and substantial. The operational challenges were complex and demanding. The family dynamics were fraught with 15 years of resentment and misunderstanding. But the strategic opportunities were also genuine and achievable. The company had strong fundamentals, capable leadership, and a workforce that was committed to quality and innovation. Most importantly, the transformation my grandfather had initiated was working. It just needed to be accelerated and expanded to address the financial pressures his gamble had created. "I'm planning to accept," I said, "but not just the inheritance. I want to propose a modification to the transition arrangement." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What kind of modification?" "Instead of a 6-month trial period where we're essentially competing for control, what if we structure a permanent partnership? You remain as Chief Operating Officer with full authority over day-to-day operations. I take the CEO position with responsibility for strategic planning and external relationships. We make major decisions together, but we each have clear areas of authority and accountability. And if we disagree on important issues, then we work it out like business partners do, through analysis, discussion, and compromise. The goal isn't for one of us to be right and the other to be wrong. The goal is for the company and the family to succeed." Marcus was quiet, considering the proposal. "It would require trust," he said finally. "Yes, it would. But based on this morning's conversation, I think we might be able to build that trust through working together on shared challenges." He extended his hand across the desk. "Let's give it a try, partner." As I shook his hand, I realized that my grandfather's elaborate planning had accomplished something I hadn't expected. Instead of creating a successor to his individual leadership, he'd created the foundation for a collaborative approach that might be stronger than either Marcus or I could have achieved alone. But there was still one more challenge to address: convincing the rest of the family that this partnership could work, and managing the dynamics that had been set in motion by the will reading. That conversation would require different skills and a different kind of strategic thinking than anything I'd learned in my consulting career. The family meeting I'd requested for the following evening took place in the main conference room at Hartwell Industries, the same space where board meetings had been held for decades. But this wasn't a board meeting. This was a reckoning with 15 years of accumulated resentments, misunderstandings, and the shocking revelations that had upended everyone's assumptions about both my capabilities and the family's financial security. Victoria arrived first, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained agitation. She'd spent the past day researching my consulting business, and the information she'd found had clearly challenged her preconceptions about my life in California. "I read the Harvard Business Review case study," she said without preamble as she took her seat. "The one about your methodology for manufacturing transformation. It's actually quite impressive, though I still don't understand why you never told the family about your success. Because every time I came home, the conversation was about how I'd disappointed everyone by not joining the family business." I replied. It seemed easier to let people think what they wanted to think rather than defend choices I'd already made. Robert and Patricia arrived next, followed by Eleanor, who looked as if she'd aged years in the past week. The revelation that Thomas had risked the family's financial security on his strategic gamble had shaken her more than any other family member, and her usual imperious confidence had been replaced by obvious worry. Madison slouched into her chair, phone in hand as always, but I noticed she was actually paying attention rather than scrolling through social media. Timothy brought up the rear, carrying a leather portfolio that I suspected contained additional documents he'd discovered. Marcus had positioned himself at the head of the table, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged his current authority while also creating space for the collaborative approach we'd discussed. When everyone was seated, he stood to address the group. "Before Jessica and I explain what we've learned about grandfather's financial arrangements," Marcus began, "I want to acknowledge something. Yesterday, I accused Jessica of inheriting something she hadn't earned. After spending the morning reviewing her consulting work and business achievements, I owe her a public apology. Her qualifications for running Hartwell Industries are actually stronger than my own in several key areas." The statement sent a ripple of surprise around the table. Eleanor's eyebrows rose, Victoria leaned forward with interest, and Robert exchanged glances with Patricia. "However," Marcus continued, "the situation we're facing is more complex than anyone realized yesterday. Jessica and I have discovered that grandfather's strategic transformation of the company was funded through personal loans that put the entire family's financial security at risk." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus and I took turns explaining what Timothy had uncovered. The balloon payments, the personal guarantees, the elaborate research into my consulting background, and the proof of concept testing that had validated my strategic recommendations. With each revelation, the expressions around the table shifted from surprise to concern to something approaching panic. "You're saying we could lose everything?" Madison asked, her phone finally forgotten. "The houses, the trust funds, all of it?" "If the company doesn't generate enough cash flow to cover grandfather's debt obligations," I replied, "then yes, the family assets that were used as collateral would be at risk." Eleanor was studying the loan documents with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades managing family finances. "These payment schedules, the largest balloon payment is due in 18 months. How much additional revenue would the company need to generate to cover it?" Marcus pulled out the financial projections we'd developed together. "Based on current cash flow, we'd need to increase annual profits by approximately $15 million within the next year and a half." "That's a substantial increase," Robert observed. "Is it realistic?" "Actually, yes," I replied, opening my laptop to show the strategic plan Marcus and I had created. "We've identified several initiatives that could generate the necessary revenue growth but they'll require coordinated implementation and some upfront investment. I walked the family through our analysis of the aerospace components opportunity, the geographic expansion possibilities, and the potential for licensing proprietary technologies. Victoria asked sharp questions about market conditions and competitive positioning. Robert focused on the operational requirements and timeline challenges. Even Eleanor engaged with the financial projections, though her questions revealed deep skepticism about our ability to execute such an ambitious plan. "This all sounds very optimistic," Eleanor said finally, "but it assumes everything goes according to plan. What happens if these new markets don't develop as quickly as you're projecting? What if competitors respond more aggressively than you expect?" It was exactly the right question to ask, and one that demonstrated Eleanor's understanding of business risk management. "We've built contingency plans into every initiative," I replied, "but you're right that there are no guarantees. That's why Marcus and I are proposing a partnership structure that combines his operational expertise with my strategic planning capabilities." "Partnership?" Victoria asked. "I thought the will specified that Jessica would become CEO after the transition period." Marcus and I exchanged glances, then he explained the modified arrangement we'd discussed. "Instead of competing for control during a 6-month trial period, we're proposing to work together as permanent partners. Jessica would handle strategic planning, external relationships, and business development. I would manage day-to-day operations, manufacturing, and internal administration." "And decision-making authority?" Robert asked. "Shared for major strategic decisions, individual authority within our respective domains," I replied. "It's similar to the partnership structures I've seen work successfully at other family businesses facing similar challenges." Timothy opened his portfolio and pulled out several case studies. "I've been researching family business transitions, and the most successful ones typically involve collaborative leadership rather than individual succession. Companies that try to replicate the founder's individual authority often struggle when the founder's unique combination of skills can't be replicated in a single successor." Eleanor was reviewing the partnership proposal with obvious skepticism. "This assumes you two can work together effectively. You've had one productive conversation after 15 years of family tension. That's not exactly a proven track record." "You're right," I acknowledged. "But it's also true that we've never had the opportunity to collaborate as professional equals before. This morning's strategic planning session suggests we might complement each other well if we can put family history aside and focus on business objectives." "The alternative," Marcus added, "is for me to try to manage both strategic and operational responsibilities during a period when the company needs rapid transformation. I'm not sure that's realistic given the timeline pressures we're facing." Madison had been quietly reviewing the financial documents while the rest of us talked. "There's something I don't understand," she said suddenly. "If Grandpa Thomas was so confident in Jessica's abilities, why didn't he just bring her into the company directly? Why all the secrecy and manipulation?" It was a perceptive question from someone I'd always dismissed as superficial and uninterested in family business matters. "I think," I said slowly, "he knew that the family dynamics would make it impossible for me to be accepted as a legitimate contributor. If I'd shown up 5 years ago claiming I could help save the company, would anyone have taken me seriously?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Everyone in the room knew that I would have been dismissed, possibly even ridiculed, if I'd tried to insert myself into family business discussions based solely on my consulting credentials. So he created a situation where my expertise could be demonstrated before family politics could interfere, I continued. The consulting projects allowed him to test my capabilities while forcing the family to confront the results of my recommendations. Victoria was nodding slowly. "It's actually quite clever, though ethically questionable. He bypassed the family's preconceptions by hiding your involvement until after you'd proven your value. But it was also manipulative," Eleanor pointed out. "Thomas orchestrated this entire situation to force outcomes he wanted, rather than allowing Natural family processes to develop. Maybe, Timothy said. But natural family processes weren't working. The company was slowly losing ground to competitors. Marcus was struggling with strategic challenges that weren't his strengths, and Jessica was building expertise that could have been valuable to the family business if anyone had bothered to pay attention. The observation stung because it was accurate, but it also created an opening for the conversation I'd been dreading, addressing the accumulated resentments and misunderstandings that had shaped our family relationships for 15 years. I need to acknowledge something, I said, looking around the table. When I left North Carolina, I was angry and hurt, but I was also arrogant. I thought I knew better than everyone else, and I dismissed the family business as old-fashioned and irrelevant. I never tried to understand the complexities Marcus was managing or the challenges grandfather was facing. Marcus nodded appreciatively. And I need to acknowledge that I was threatened by your academic achievements and your independence. Instead of trying to learn from your different perspective, I focused on defending traditional approaches that weren't always working as well as I claimed. This is all very touching, Eleanor said dryly. But personal reconciliation doesn't solve our financial problems. We still need to know whether this partnership can actually generate the results you're projecting. Patricia, who'd been quiet throughout most of the discussion, spoke up unexpectedly. Maybe we should look at this differently. Instead of debating whether Jessica and Marcus can work together, what if we focused on whether their combined expertise gives us the best chance of success? She pulled out her own notes, which I was surprised to see were quite detailed. I've been married to Robert for 5 years, which means I've watched this family struggle with business challenges while refusing to acknowledge that the traditional approaches weren't adequate for current market conditions. Jessica's consulting. Track record suggests she understands how to help companies adapt. Marcus's operational knowledge means he understands how to implement changes without disrupting essential business functions. Together, they might actually be able to accomplish what neither could do alone. Robert was staring at his wife with obvious surprise. Patricia, I didn't know you'd been paying such close attention to the business issues. I pay attention to everything that affects my family's security, she replied. And right now, our security depends on whether Hartwell Industries can generate enough additional revenue to cover Thomas's debt obligations. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members raising concerns, asking questions, and gradually working through the implications of what we were proposing. By the end of the evening, we hadn't achieved unanimous enthusiasm, but we had reached consensus on several key points. First, the financial pressures were real and required immediate action. Second, the strategic plan Marcus and I had developed offered the most realistic path to generating the necessary revenue increases. Third, our partnership approach was untested, but represented the best combination of skills available to address the challenges the company was facing. Most importantly, we'd established a framework for family communication that acknowledged both the business realities and the personal relationships that had been strained by years of misunderstanding and neglect. So what happens next? Madison asked as we prepared to adjourn. Jessica and I start working together immediately, Marcus replied. We'll begin implementing the strategic initiatives we've identified while establishing the operational frameworks for our partnership. The rest of you will receive monthly progress reports and quarterly financial updates. And if it doesn't work? Victoria asked. Then we'll adapt, I said. But failure isn't really an option given what's at stake for the family's financial security. Eleanor gathered her papers with the brisk efficiency I remembered from childhood. I still have reservations about this arrangement, she said, but I have to admit that the alternatives are worse. Just remember that you're not just managing a business, you're stewarding a legacy that affects everyone in this room. As the family members filed out of the conference room, I found myself alone with Marcus and Timothy. The weight of what we'd committed to accomplish was settling on my shoulders, but for the first time since the will reading, I felt genuinely optimistic about our chances for success. Think we can pull this off? Marcus asked. "I think," I replied, "that we're about to find out what we're really capable of when we work together instead of against each other." The real test was just beginning. 18 months later, I stood in the same conference room where my grandfather's will had been read, but everything else had changed. The mahogany table was covered with contracts, financial reports, and celebration champagne that Marcus had brought to mark a milestone none of us had been certain we could achieve. "The final balloon payment has been transferred," Harold Morrison announced, reviewing the wire transfer confirmations on his tablet. "Thomas's personal loans are now fully satisfied, and all family assets have been released from collateral obligations." The relief in the room was palpable. Eleanor actually smiled, something I hadn't seen her do since before my grandfather's death. Robert raised his champagne glass in a toast, while Victoria pulled out her phone to share the news with her sons. Even Madison looked genuinely happy, though she was probably calculating how this financial security would affect her trust fund distributions. But the real celebration wasn't about the debt payments. It was about what we'd accomplished together during the most challenging period in Hartwell Industries' history. "The Aerospace Components Division generated $12 million in revenue this quarter," Marcus reported, his voice carrying pride and relief in equal measure. "We now have contracts with 3 major defense contractors and 2 commercial aerospace companies. The precision manufacturing capabilities we developed through the Morrison acquisition have exceeded every projection." I added the numbers to the financial summary we'd been building throughout the meeting. Combined with the sustainable materials, program expansion, and the new Southeast regional facilities, total revenue is up 37% from when we started the transition. More importantly, profit margins have improved across every business line. Timothy, who'd joined the company 6 months earlier as Director of Innovation and Employee Development, contributed his own update. "Workforce retention is at an all-time high, and we've added 215 new jobs across all divisions. The employee satisfaction surveys show dramatic improvements in morale and engagement. The employment numbers were particularly meaningful to me. Throughout the transformation process, I'd insisted that growth should create opportunities for existing workers rather than replacing them with automation or outsourcing. It had been more expensive in the short term, but the results vindicated the investment in human capital." "What about the technology licensing program?" Eleanor asked. She'd remained skeptical of many of our initiatives, but her financial acumen had been valuable in evaluating risk and return projections. 3 companies have signed licensing agreements for our sustainable manufacturing processes," I replied. "The royalty payments are modest now, but they're projected to generate $2 to $3 million annually within 5 years as environmental regulations become more stringent industry-wide." Sarah Chen, who'd become our external legal counsel for the transition, was taking notes for the formal documentation that would conclude the 18-month partnership trial period. Based on these results, the board of directors has unanimously approved the permanent partnership structure between Jessica and Marcus. The legal documents formalizing their co-leadership arrangement are ready for signature. The partnership had evolved beyond our initial conception. Rather than dividing responsibilities strictly between strategic and operational functions, Marcus and I had discovered that our most effective collaboration occurred when we approached major decisions together, bringing our different perspectives to bear on complex challenges. I handled external relationships, business development, and long-term planning, while Marcus managed day-to-day operations, manufacturing, and internal systems. But we made important decisions jointly, creating a leadership model that was stronger than either of us could have provided individually. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Marcus said, pulling out a folder I hadn't seen before. "The expansion opportunities that have emerged from our success." He opened the folder to reveal preliminary discussions with 3 companies that wanted to partner with Hartwell Industries on various initiatives. A renewable energy firm that needed specialized components for wind turbine systems. A medical device manufacturer that was interested in our precision manufacturing capabilities. And most intriguingly, a European textile company that wanted to license our sustainable materials technology for international markets. The international licensing opportunity is particularly interesting, I said, reviewing the preliminary terms. European environmental regulations are even more stringent than domestic requirements, and there's substantial demand for manufacturing processes that meet both performance and sustainability standards. Victoria leaned forward, her business instincts engaged. What kind of revenue potential are we talking about? Conservatively, 5 to 8 million annually within 3 years, Marcus replied. But the real value is strategic positioning. If we can establish ourselves as the technology leader in sustainable manufacturing, we create competitive advantages that are difficult for other companies to replicate. Eleanor was studying the international licensing proposal with the same intensity she'd brought to analyzing our debt obligations 18 months earlier. The European market would require substantial investment in compliance and certification. Are we prepared for that level of complexity? Actually, Timothy interjected, that's where our employee development programs create additional value. We've been training our workforce in international quality standards and environmental compliance. The capabilities we've built for domestic markets translate directly to international opportunities. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members asking questions, raising concerns, and gradually embracing the possibilities that our success had created. But what struck me most was how naturally everyone participated in the strategic discussion. The antagonism and suspicion that had characterized our early meetings had been replaced by genuine collaboration focused on advancing shared interests. Madison, who'd surprised everyone by completing an MBA program during the transition period, contributed market analysis she'd prepared on European manufacturing trends. Robert offered insights into the operational challenges of international expansion based on his experience with the company's domestic growth. Even Eleanor participated constructively, identifying potential legal and financial complications that needed to be addressed. When we finally concluded the business discussion, Harold Morrison gathered the formal documents that would conclude the transition process and establish the permanent leadership structure. But before anyone could sign anything, Eleanor requested permission to make a statement. 18 months ago, she began, her voice carrying the authority that had made her a formidable presence in family affairs for decades. I thought Thomas had made a catastrophic mistake in naming Jessica as his heir. I believed the family business should remain under traditional leadership, and I resented what seemed like manipulation of the succession process. She paused, looking directly at me. I was wrong. Not just about Jessica's qualifications, but about what the company needed to survive in a changing economy. The transformation we've accomplished under her partnership with Marcus has not only preserved the family legacy, it's strengthened it in ways I wouldn't have thought possible. The acknowledgement was more meaningful to me than any business success we'd achieved. Eleanor's approval had always seemed impossibly out of reach, and hearing her publicly recognize the value of what we'd accomplished felt like a validation of everything I'd worked to prove. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, I want to acknowledge that the family dynamics that drove Jessica away 15 years ago were destructive and short-sighted. We failed to recognize her potential because we were too invested in maintaining traditional roles and expectations. That failure nearly cost us everything. Victoria nodded in agreement. I think we all learned something about assumptions and preconceptions. Jessica's success forced us to reconsider not just business strategies, but how we evaluate capability and contribution within the family. Robert raised his champagne glass again. To new traditions that honor the best of the old ones while embracing the innovations necessary for the future. As we toasted the conclusion of the transition period and the beginning of the permanent partnership, I reflected on everything that had changed since I'd walked into Harold Morrison's conference room 18 months earlier. The most obvious changes were financial. The family's security had been preserved, the company's profitability had improved dramatically, and hundreds of employees had secure, well-paying jobs. But the deeper changes were relational and cultural. Marcus and I had developed a working relationship that was both professionally effective and personally satisfying. We'd learned to leverage our different strengths while compensating for each other's limitations, creating a leadership model that was more resilient than traditional individual authority structures. The family had moved beyond the resentments and misunderstandings that had shaped our interactions for years. We'd established communication patterns based on shared problem-solving rather than defensive positioning, and we'd created frameworks for including everyone's perspectives in major decisions. Most importantly, we'd preserved and strengthened the Hartwell legacy while adapting it to meet contemporary challenges. The company that Thomas Hartwell had built over 7 decades remained true to its core values of quality, integrity, and community responsibility. But it had also evolved to embrace innovation, sustainability, and collaborative leadership in ways that positioned it for continued success. As the formal meeting concluded and family members began gathering their belongings, Marcus approached me with a contemplative expression. "Do you ever wonder what grandfather would think of what we've accomplished?" he asked. I considered the question, thinking about the letter Thomas had left for me and the elaborate planning he'd undertaken to create this opportunity. I think he'd be proud that we exceeded his projections, but not surprised. I think he understood our potential better than we understood it ourselves. And your life in California? Do you miss it? It was a fair question. I'd relocated permanently to North Carolina 6 months earlier, selling my house in Carmel and transferring my consulting practice to focus exclusively on Hartwell Industries. The change had been more significant than I'd anticipated, requiring adjustment to different rhythms and relationships. I miss some aspects of it, I replied honestly. The quiet mornings, the independence, the ability to choose my projects based solely on professional interest. But I don't miss the isolation or the sense that I was building something separate from family and community connections. Timothy joined our conversation, having overheard the question about my California life. What about your writing? Are you planning to continue working on novels? Actually, yes, I said, surprising both of them. I've been working on a book about family business transitions and the challenges of preserving legacy while embracing change. It turns out I have some recent experience with that topic. Marcus laughed. Just promise you'll change the names to protect the innocent. And the guilty, I added with a smile. As we prepared to leave the conference room, Eleanor approached me for a private conversation. Despite the public acknowledgments and improved family dynamics, she and I had maintained a somewhat formal relationship throughout the transition period. "Jessica," she said, "I have a confession to make. When Thomas first started talking about bringing you back into the family business, I actively discouraged him. I thought it would be disruptive and potentially destructive to everything we'd built." I waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. What I failed to understand was that what we'd built wasn't as strong as we thought. The traditional approaches that had worked for decades were becoming inadequate for contemporary challenges. We needed fresh perspectives and innovative solutions, but I was too invested in familiar patterns to recognize that need. The resistance was understandable, I replied. Change is always threatening, especially when it challenges fundamental assumptions about how things should work. Eleanor nodded. What I've learned from watching your partnership with Marcus is that the most successful changes don't destroy existing strengths. They build on them while adding new capabilities. You didn't come in and overturn everything Thomas had created. You found ways to preserve the best elements while improving the areas that needed development. It was perhaps the most personal conversation Eleanor and I had ever had, and it felt like the final piece of reconciliation that had been missing throughout the transition process. As I drove home that evening, passing the familiar landmarks of Charlotte that had once felt like symbols of constraint, but now felt like symbols of belonging, I realized that my grandfather's legacy hadn't been just the company he'd built or the wealth he'd accumulated. His real legacy was the lesson that true strength comes from adapting to change while remaining true to core values. I'd inherited more than a business. I'd inherited a responsibility to ensure that the next generation would receive something even stronger and more resilient than what had been passed down to me. The gold digger who'd supposedly married into wealth had become the steward of a family. Legacy that would endure long after the circumstances that created it had faded into history. And perhaps most importantly, I'd discovered that coming home didn't mean giving up who I'd become. It meant bringing everything I'd learned back to the place where I'd first learned what really mattered. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.